In the summer of 2012, Jamie Keller and Lori Mortenson disappeared deep in the Appalachian Mountains. After searching for over a month, the only thing authorities were able to find was Jamie's mud-covered cell phone. Jamie was able to record an audio account of the grisly details of what happened to her and her best friend, Lori, before they both disappeared. Along with the audio recording was the last known photo taken of Jamie as she slept in their tent. This is her story as relayed by Detective Boyd Robinson, who was in charge of the investigation. The Roanoke, Virginia Police Department has adamantly refused over the years to release the actual audio recording out of respect for the family's wishes. "Run, Jamie, run," was the last thing I heard before blacking out and waking face up staring into the cold darkness. The only light were the stars shining brightly in the sky. I could see my warm breath above me as I exhaled the cold mountain air. I remember thinking how beautiful the stars looked in the mountains compared to the big polluted city I live in. It didn't take long for reality to hit me and remember I'd been running for my life before I blacked out. I immediately sat up and began to look around for my friend, who I thought in that moment was supposed to be right behind me before I tripped, hitting my head on a dead fallen log which knocked me clean out. I put my hand up to my face and could feel the dry crusted blood that had been oozing out of the gash on my forehead. I put my hand on the log next to me and tried quietly standing up, but as I did, I immediately felt nauseous, so I quickly sat back down. As I sat there trying to decide what my next course of action should be, I began wondering where my friend Lori was, and wondering if she was still alive. I decided it would be best if I waited in this spot until morning, so I don't get lost or worse, get found. I thought about calling out to Lori, but quickly decided against that. The last thing I wanted was the man with the skins to find me. I laid back down between the fallen logs and stared back up at the stars. The events that transpired over the last few days started running through my head. It all started with my best friend Lori and me wanting to get away from the city for a few days and do some camping. We don't go camping a lot, so we asked for recommendations from some friends where we should go. They recommended a spot that was quite a ways back in the mountains, so we could avoid other campers, being the point was to get away from it all. As we drove for several hours along the old dirt road that took us to a small lake, we could tell not too many cars traveled this dirt road. This made us both nervous, but for some reason we continued driving down that old bumpy dirt road until we made it to the small lake. We played it off as we were just being overly nervous. We'd gotten to the lake in the afternoon when it was still light, so that did make us feel a little better, but reality hit us that we were the only ones there. As we were setting up camp, I could hear the nervousness in Lori's voice, asking me if I'd like to go down the dirt road somewhere else, to where we'd seen other campers. As I laid there in the darkness between the logs, I pounded my fist on the hard cold ground and cursed myself for not saying yes to her and moving our camp that day. The thought of dread entered my mind, knowing I might never see my best friend again. Or worse, I might not make it out of here alive. I must have finally drifted off to sleep, because the next thing I remember was the warmth of the sun hitting my face, between the two big logs I was laying in between. Before I sat up, I tried looking around the area to make sure it was safe, but the forest was too thick with pine trees to see past 10 feet. As I slowly sat up, I made sure to scan my surroundings. As I sat up, I noticed the forest was dead silent. So silent, in fact, it was almost deafening. I could feel the vibrations of the earth and the beat of my heart. I reached out to the closest log and slowly stood up. Luckily this time, I didn't get nauseous. My head was very sore, and I could feel the dry, crusted blood that covered my face. I thought, I must look like roadkill. As I stood there, I turned around in a full circle, looking for Lori, but there was nothing but pine trees everywhere, and dead fallen logs covering the ground. I stood there for several more minutes, trying to decide which way to go, because I had no idea where I even was or which was the way back to the lake to where our camp was. I certainly didn't want to head in the wrong direction that would take me back to the man with the skins. I finally decided to take the path of least resistance, being I was still in pain from all that had happened to us over the last few days. I slowly stumbled through the forest, trying to be as quiet as I could, for fear that the man with the skins would find me again. As I stumbled along, my mind wandered back to the first encounter we'd had with the man with the skins. The first night at camp, as we were laying down in the tent, talking and laughing about various things, there was a pause in our conversation, and right as we paused, we could hear footsteps outside the tent. At first we thought it might be an animal, but as it got closer and closer, there was no mistaking that whatever it was two-legged and not four. It was most certainly a person walking. We immediately froze with fear and ceased speaking. When the person got within several feet of our tent, they came to a sudden stop. The only thing we could hear was the sound of them breathing. It was a heavy, raspy breathing, like the sound of someone who had been smoking cigarettes for 40 years. Lori and I held each other as we trembled in fear, waiting for what was to come next. Minutes went by as the person stood there, not moving a muscle, only breathing. After what seemed like hours, the person suddenly, and without warning, turned around and walked off into the woods. We laid there shaking in fear the rest of the night. Neither one of us slept a wink. We whispered to each other about packing up and leaving as soon as it got first light outside. When morning came, what a joyous sight it was to see the sun shining on the outside of our tent. Lori unzipped the tent and was the first one to step outside. Right as her foot hit the ground, a dark hairy arm grabbed her by the neck and literally threw her the rest of the way out of the tent. It sent her stumbling several feet away, hitting the ground hard enough to almost knock her out. Right then, I met the man with the skins, face to face. He stood there looking at me from several feet away with an expressionless look on his face. He reached into the tent and tried grabbing me. I kicked and punched, trying to keep him away, but he was too strong, and easily got a hold of my neck and threw me out of the tent. I hit the ground with a hard thud, just like Lori. He then went over and punched Lori in the face, so hard it knocked her out cold. I can still hear the thwacking sound in my mind as he struck her face. The man with the skins then came over to me and started tying my feet and hands behind my back. It was so tight it cut off my blood circulation almost immediately. The man with the skins then picked up Lori's lifeless body like a bear would pick up its kill and carried her off into the woods. I tried as best I could to get loose from the ropes, but they were so tight I couldn't budge the knots an inch. The only thing I could do was lay there praying somehow I would get free, or that someone would come driving down that bumpy dirt road. No one did. An hour went by before the man with the skins came out of the trees and picked me up just like he'd done with Lori and started carrying me off into the trees. He carried me with my head down and behind him so I couldn't see where we were going or see much at all, only the ground. After a while, we finally came to a clearing and I could see things on the ground that indicated someone lived there. The man with the skins dropped me to the ground in a heap, which hurt like hell. I dared not sit up or move much, but I could see an old shack in front of me. All of a sudden, I heard Lori behind me whisper my name. I stayed laying in my position, but responded back to her asking if she was okay, to which she responded she was, but she was in pain. I tried looking around as best I could without moving too much. I wanted to see where the man with the skins was, but couldn't see anything from my position. Hours went by before we finally heard something behind us in the woods getting closer and closer. When it finally got within a few feet, it suddenly stopped and we could hear the raspy breathing again, and knew it was the man with the skins. He stood there for a few minutes before finally walking into the shack and shutting the door. From behind I could see his clothes were torn and dirty, and he had scraggly hair that went down past his shoulders. One thing I did really take notice of, and that was he was barefoot. Even with the amount of pain I was in, I was still able to think it was odd that he could be barefoot in the mountains. I must have been in shock because overwhelming fear hadn't really set in yet. I was thinking of ways to escape as I continually worked to loosen the knots on my hands, but to no avail. They were just too damn tight. My hands were completely numb at this point, which meant I couldn't move them much, if at all. Darkness finally came, and the man with the skins never came out of the shack again that day. That night was a long one, as I laid on the cold, bare ground, with my face half planted in the dirt. I could hear Lori whispering and quietly crying all night. We both dared not speak, for fear of what would happen if we did. Morning finally came, and I was thankful, because I thought I was going to die from hypothermia during the night. I'm still not sure how I didn't. It wasn't long before the man with the skins opened the door to his shack and stepped outside. I could look up slightly and see his dirt-covered, mangy face glaring at us. He walked over, picked up Lori, and carried her into the shack. She didn't even put up a fight as he carried her into the shack and closed the door behind them. As he was closing the door, he looked back at me and gave me a look of evil like I'd never seen before. All of a sudden, I heard Lori let out a blood-curdling scream. The screaming went on, never seeming to stop, as the tears rolled down my cheeks. I could only imagine the horror she must be experiencing. Her screams turned into a gurgling sound, and then without warning, they suddenly stopped. And then silence. By this time, I couldn't move at all, due to being tied up for so long and having lost the feeling in all my extremities long ago. I started telling myself I wasn't going to make it out of this forest alive. I must have passed out from God knows what. The pain, lack of water, or lack of circulation. But I woke up to a bloodied Lori standing over me. She was dripping blood from a stump that used to be her right arm. Her face was expressionless, almost like a zombie's face. She reached down to my hands with her left hand and started to untie the rope. It took her a while, being she was in a deep state of shock, and she's right-handed, and now she had no right hand. After she freed my hands, she started to untie my feet. While she was doing that, I tried moving my hands to get the blood flowing again, because they were completely numb at this point. We sat there for a few minutes while Lori worked the knot on my feet, and me trying to get blood flowing back into my hands again. Panic suddenly hit me, because I hadn't thought about the man with the skins and where he was at the moment. As I slowly started getting some feeling back into my hands, I reached down to help Lori with the knot, and after a minute or two, we finally got my legs free. Now I needed to get the feeling into my feet before I could even think about standing up, let alone getting the hell out of there. I sat there massaging my legs, trying to push the blood down into my feet as quickly as I could. It took some time, but I could finally feel the blood starting to flow again. I slowly tried standing up, but needed help from a tree that was next to me. Lori sat there not uttering a word, and neither did I. I figured it was best if we both kept quiet. I could only imagine her silence was from shock. Once the feeling in my feet came back enough, I decided we needed to get the hell out of there while we still had the chance. I reached down and grabbed Lori by her left arm and whispered to her to stand up. It took some coaxing, but she finally stood up and we started walking away from the shack as fast as we could move, which wasn't very fast. We hadn't walked very far when we came into a clearing that was surrounded by a circle of pine trees. As we stepped into the clearing, I almost let out a scream that would have shook the forest, but held it in. In the middle of the clearing were a pile of human bodies, all of them without their skins. They were scattered everywhere, but what was more horrific than that was the skins of the bodies were being hung up and stretched out to be dried, much like a trapper would stretch out the fur from a beaver. As I stood there in horror, I heard something making noise back at the shack, and knew instantly the man with the skins had come back. I grabbed Lori's left arm and whispered to her that we needed to get out of there quickly, so we took off as fast as we could. As we walked, we stepped on the dried leaves that covered the forest floor. It sounded like we were stepping on potato chips, and I knew the man with the skins would certainly hear us. Our only bet was to try and outrun him, but that was going to be extremely difficult, considering the current state we were in and Lori still being in a deep state of shock. Being a nurse, I was wondering why she hadn't bled out yet, but the only explanation was that the man with the skins must have cauterized her stump after he cut her arm off. Not long after that thought, I could hear the crunching of leaves. The man with the skins was approaching us from behind, and at a rapid pace. I turned to Lori and said, "Lori, we've got to hurry. He's coming." With my arm wrapped around her, I tried to move as fast as I could, with the both of us. But no matter how fast I tried to move, Lori could not. I'll never forget what happened next. Lori turned to me and said, "Go, Jamie, go. Get out of here." I stood there contemplating what to do, and in that split second, I knew both of us would die if I didn't run. So I gut-wrenchingly left my best friend sitting there, and I took off running through the thick forest as fast as I could. As I was running, I could hear Lori screaming behind me, "Run, Jamie, run!" Over and over again. It was then I tripped, knocking myself out on the fallen log. Those thoughts replayed in my mind over and over as I stumbled through the thick forest, not knowing exactly where I was or where I was going. I tried my best to be as quiet as possible, but the leaves still made so much damn noise. Not as bad as the day before, though, due to the fact there was morning dew on the leaves, which left them a little moist. This made it somewhat quieter, but I knew as the day heated up, the leaves would be crunchy again. I needed to make it to the dirt road before the man with the skins found me again. I stumbled through the forest for hours before finally coming to a small clearing. As I entered the clearing, I looked up and could see I was at the base of some cliffs. I looked side to side and the cliffs seemed to go on forever. At that moment, I gave up hope. I was exhausted, hungry and thirsty, but worse, I knew I was lost. In my frustration, I lay down in the clearing with the heat of the sun glaring on my face, and I quickly fell asleep. When I awoke, the sun had moved over the mountains, and it was getting into the evening hours. I sat up and tried to swallow, but my throat hurt like hell because I hadn't drank any water for quite some time. Being a nurse, I knew I needed to find water soon, or I wouldn't last much longer. The best idea I came up with was to walk down the mountain and listen for a stream or river, some type of water flowing. This idea came from the fact I was too exhausted to walk uphill, so my only choice was to walk down. I stood up from the log and looked for which direction might be going downhill, and set off slowly stumbling along. After a few hundred yards, I could see I had at least made the right choice in which direction to go, because the mountain was sloping down. As I stumbled along, I tried to intently listen for the sound of flowing water, but all I heard was dead silence. I felt like giving up, but knew if I didn't find water very soon, I would get too delirious to move, or I might die from dehydration. I was never one to give up, so I pushed on. An hour went by before I caught the faint sound of something running through the forest to my left. Panic struck me as I glanced over, but to my relief, I saw the butt of a deer as it ran away. As I turned my head back to start walking again, I noticed something between the trees, something shiny. Could it be, I thought, and focused more intently on it, and sure enough, it looked like water. I turned and started walking towards it, and as I got closer, I could see it was a small pond. I could also see it didn't look very clean, but at this point, I didn't care. It was drink or die. As I knelt down to drink, I thought the deer I saw must have been coming to or leaving this pond. Thank God for the deer, or I would have walked right past it. As I drank, I could taste the silt from the pond, but I could also feel my body thanking me for giving me what it was so craving. I drank and drank until my stomach was bloated and full of water. I then laid down next to the pond and again fell asleep. As I slept, I had the most horrific nightmares about the man with the skins. I dreamt I was watching him skin Lori alive. I could see the horror on Lori's face and could hear her blood-curdling screams as he sliced and peeled off her skin, and there was nothing I could do about it. All of a sudden, I was jolted out of my dream. I looked up in horror at the man with the skins standing over me. Before I could let out a scream, he bashed me in the head with a big tree branch, knocking me out. I woke up later with my head throbbing as I was being carried through the forest. He carried me into a clearing and threw me down to the ground. He grabbed my hands and tied them to the tree as I screamed and begged him to let me go. When he finished tying my hands and left, I realized I was in the area with all the skinned human bodies and stretched out skins. I looked up in horror as I recognized a tattoo on one of the stretched out skins. It was Lori's. All I could do was scream in horror, knowing I was next. For more scary horror stories, please subscribe.